and thanks very much for the invitation. So as Gabriella said, today I'm going to be talking about working with large amounts of qualitative data and introducing you to the breadth and depth method. So when we think about big data, it's typically in terms of quantitative data sets that can be analysed computationally to reveal patterns, trends and associations, especially in relation to human behaviour and interactions. However, the growing availability of large qualitative data sets facilitated through archiving and data sharing, along with a range of new computational tools, offer many exciting opportunities for researchers. So I thought I'd start by introducing you to the team. So this is not something I developed on my own, but this is sort of, I feel I'm giving this presentation on behalf of the Big Qual team, and that comprises Rosalind Edwards at the University of Southampton and Lynn Jameson and Emma Davison at the University of Edinburgh. And we've been working together in different capacities for many years, but specifically on big qual analysis since 2015. So today I'm going to outline the development, process and utility of a method for large-scale qualitative analysis that we developed together over a number of years. And in creating the method, we felt that in order to work with qualitative integrity, it was really important to combine the insights offered by computational techniques, ideal for exploring the breadth of a large data set, with the benefits of in-depth analytic work offered by more conventional forms of qualitative analysis. So in short, we felt that it was important to ensure that any innovations in big qual analysis are developed in a manner that retains the integrity of a contextual and detailed qualitative research. So today I thought I'd start off by sort of setting the scene, telling you about why we developed the method. I'll then talk you through the method. It's a 4-step iterative process, so I'll take you through each of the 4 steps and then reflect on what we see as some of the kind of value of doing big qual analysis. I'll then provide an illustrative example before offering some sort of finer reflections on kind of working with integrity in relation to big qual. So what is big qual, you might ask, if you haven't come across it before? And when we first presented our plans for large-scale qualitative analysis at the 2016 National Centre for Research Methods Festival, we were asked, why would you want to do that? So we didn't get a lot of kind of encouragement then. And although there was kind of interest in the possibilities of pooling and working across multiple data sets, many were really cautious about the ethical and epistemological implications. The interest in the possibilities has really grown since then, and we've been very fortunate to benefit from 2 grants from the National Centre for Research Methods, which I'll come to shortly, that has enabled us to work in this space. So we've actually been working on this for 9 years now, and this has really been in response to 2 interconnected developments. So the first is the rapidly expanding open science movement and associated drive to promote data sharing. So as I'm sure you're all aware, publicly funded agencies increasingly require research data to be made available to the wider research community. And data sharing has tended to be more commonplace for quantitative researchers. And really, open access still continues to pose epistemological and methodological questions for qualitative researchers. And I think one of the sort of enduring discussions has been around the centrality of context and the feeling that you kind of need to have been there, you need to have conducted that interview or facilitated that focus group to be able to interpret the data. The archives are now a critical infrastructure for storing qualitative research data and a source of good practice for qualitative researchers wishing to engage in sharing and reuse. And this movement has continued to expand internationally, reflected in the growing numbers of initiatives and projects reusing qualitative data. And I was at a new network, the International Qualitative Secondary Analysis Network, earlier this week at a meeting discussing some of the challenges of doing qualitative secondary analysis across different national contexts. And the second kind of reason is kind of the expansion of computational text analysis, which has provided researchers with a range of sophisticated tools and techniques for analysing enormous amounts of text data at relative speed and efficiency. And these tools are really sort of advanced as part of the big data movement. And a particular value to qualitative researchers has been text analysis, so using computational tools to sort and process large amounts of text. However, computational text analysis and associated tools can often prioritise quantitative knowledge and maybe kind of lack the necessary theoretical framing and rigour in interpretation for dealing with quantitative data sources. So with increasing emphasis on big data analytics, we were really keen to ensure that kind of qualitative research and qualitative researchers are not left behind in all these discussions or sidelined in this debates around big data. And I think it's fair to say that qualitative inquiry is increasingly being recognised as having a critical role within big data, with acknowledgement that its philosophy and analytic tools are necessary for facilitating understanding about social context, about processes, about subjectivities, about complexity. But in many respects, analytic techniques still remain in their infancy, often relying on things like descriptive content analysis of words or themes or concepts, or by efforts to quantify qualitative data. And this can result in the loss of rich, in-depth understandings that are central to qualitative forms of inquiry. So our idea was to try and harness the potential of computational tools designed to analyse text, and in particular to handle large volumes of text data. But we didn't want to use computational techniques uncritically at the expense of kind of the central tenets of qualitative work. Rather, we wanted to bring qualitative work into the wider debates about developing a form of analysis where computational processing of large volumes of qualitative data is given equal prominence to that kind of deep data research approaches. So in 2015, the National Centre for Research Methods funded our project, which is called Working Across Qualitative Longitudinal Studies. So we'd all had a background in longitudinal work, and it was a feasibility study. So our kind of substantive focus was on care and intimacy, but really it was to see, is big qual possible to do while still retaining all that matters to qualitative researchers? And our study looked at the possibilities for developing new procedures and expanding good analytic practice for working across multiple data sets. And we were particularly interested in archive data sets. As I'll show a bit later, we don't have to use the breadth and depth method with archive material, but this idea that we're increasingly expected to make data available, and that process takes a lot of kind of time and intellectual and emotional kind of labour on the part of qualitative researchers to prepare all that material. And actually, a lot of it is sitting unused. So kind of that was partly why we focused on archive data. But our kind of interest in using qualitative data has a much longer history. So most of the team, myself, Ros and Lynn, were involved in the ESRC Timescapes programme, which some of you may have come across, but it was the first large-scale qualitative longitudinal study to be funded by the ESRC in the UK. And the remit of Timescapes has three sort of aspects to it. One was to generate a set of qualitative longitudinal studies that focus very broadly on identities and relationships across the life course, at different phases of the life course. So we had one project looking at kind of children's transitions to adulthood through to the experiences of the oldest generation, with projects on motherhood, fatherhood, and grandparenthood and change. But also part of the remit of the study was to develop a living archive of qualitative longitudinal data, and to develop kind of ethical practice in archiving and work with research participants to talk about their feelings about archiving their data and other people be using it. And then another focus of Timescapes was on data sharing. So the idea of bringing together different projects and asking new questions of different projects and bringing projects together. So it was the data sets that were generated and archived as part of this Timescapes programme that we used to work with in different ways in developing the breadth and depth method. And then in 2018, we were fortunate to receive some more funding from the National Centre for Research Methods, which enabled us to work with a couple of our colleagues based at Southampton, Melanie Nind and Sarah Luthwaite, and they're both specialists in research methods pedagogy. So we work with them to develop strategies and tools for building capacity and use in the breadth and depth method. So I'm going to sort of move on a minute to sort of introducing you to the breadth and depth method. But before I do that, I just wanted sort of to say a couple of notes. One was on kind of what do we mean by bigness in terms of big qual data. And there's been like a lot of debates about what that means. And some authors have suggested that bigness tends to be quantified. So we've seen references to things like, well, big qual involves working with at least 100 interview transcripts, or kind of trying to put some sort of number on it. But we're not sure this is very helpful in the context of qualitative work, because you could have a very small sample of participants, but have conducted a sort of repeat interviews with those participants, or very lengthy interviews. So they're kind of, it's big in a slightly different way in terms of depth or over time. So rather than put a figure on it, we sort of, our working definition of big qual is a sort of a volume of data that's greater than an individual or research team has the capacity to manage. So sort of just rather than a specific quantity. And then also sort of note about the nature of data in this context. So far, with the breadth and depth method, we've been using verbatim transcripts and in-depth interviews and focus groups. We're currently sort of experimenting with sort of different forms of data, so some written data that was generated as part of a public engagement activity. So sort of trying to see how it works with that. And then in September, some of us are joining a hackathon at the University of Southampton, where we'll be working with computer software engineers to look at how we might use kind of machine learning to do analysis of large volumes of visual data as well. So this is all sort of work in progress and developing in different directions. So sort of in developing this method, we just knew it was simply impractical to conduct big qual manually, to analyse in depth thousands of detailed text files. So we wanted to sort of develop a means of surveying the data landscape to get a sense of the material that's available that might be of interest to your research topic or might be helpful in answering your research questions. And then to identify in a rigorous manner where you might dig deeper in appropriate places within that data landscape. And over time, over quite a lot of time, many years, we began to realise that the process was a lot like that undertaken by a field archaeologist. So like with the collection of big qual data sets constituting this landscape that must be scanned in order to get a sense of the breadth of the material and then to pinpoint features of interest. So I'll go through each step in a minute, but just wanted to give you like an overview of the 4 steps. So the first 2 really focus on the breadth, capturing the breadth and using kind of different sort of an aerial survey in archaeology terms and geophysical survey to sort of map the data landscape and identify features that might be of interest to your research topic question. Step 3 is kind of like moving from breadth to depth and kind of digging test pits in areas of that data landscape where you think there might be material of interest. And then step 4 is deep excavation, so digging deeper, using some of those approaches that are more conventional approaches that are familiar to many qualitative researchers. I just want to kind of give you a sense of what the whole process is before going on to looking at each step in more depth. And by adopting this archaeological metaphor, we are able to consider how we access data at different levels and in different ways. So to think about what lies beneath this corpus of material that's being analysed. And drawing on this archaeological metaphor helped us to work both extensively and intensively to identify and excavate meaning. So I'll take you through the 4 steps now so you get a better sense of what the sort of approach involves. So step 1 is an inquiry-led sort of overview of archived data or the kind of data that you have access to, which is undertaken to source whole or part data sets of an appropriate nature, quality and fit to either to your research topic if you do something exploratory or to your research questions if you have something more specific in mind. And this can be likened to an archaeologist's aerial survey, flying across the data landscape to kind of conduct some reconnaissance. The goal being just to gain a kind of broad overview of the data landscape, spotting features of interest, those that might lie just below the surface of the data that you might not see if you're standing at ground level. In practice, this involves sourcing data sets that have potential to help you answer a research question. I said this data might be housed in local or national repositories. So I've got some examples here that might be of interest. So there's a growing number of international repositories, but it really is, the global distribution is really skewed more towards the US and Europe at the moment in terms of the resourcing of archives like this. So these are the larger scale repositories. We've used the UK Data Archive, for instance, and they have, fair to say, varying amounts of qualitative data. So some are kind of more mixed and others are like the Irish Qualitative Data Archive, obviously purely qualitative data. And then you have like more local level archives. So Timescapes Archive that I mentioned earlier. And then here in Oxford, there's the Health Experiences Research Group archive as well. So places where you could go and access data sets generated by other people. So you could do this. You could access data generated by other individuals and teams, or you could bring together your own data with that of an archive data set. So an example of that is Dr. Sarah Wilson, whose research focuses on young people's experiences in state care. And as she was analysing her own data set, she began to wonder whether the experiences of the young people in her study were particular to their experiences and their circumstances, or whether that might reflect young people's experiences more widely. So she used our data set with a diverse range of young people and did a comparative study to see what the similarities and differences might be. Or, and I'll provide an example a bit later on, but you could work with colleagues to bring together data sets from multi-sited projects or work in different collaborations. So although I talk a lot about archive data, it doesn't have to be material that's stored within a kind of national repository. Although I guess one of the things to think about there is to think about the quality. Often data sets stored in UK Data Archive have kind of passed some kind of quality threshold in terms of the contextual information that's provided along with interview transcripts or focus group transcripts, for instance. So you could combine data sets in their entirety, or you could select cases of relevance, for instance, sampling by participant characteristics or by the method in which they were generated. Again, this depends on your research question. But the aim is to locate and review potential sources of data of an appropriate quality, nature, and fit. And to help you do this, you use the project meta-narrative, so that's things like background information about the aims of the study, copy of the protocol perhaps, copy of the application, the ethical approval, and all the papers and reports that are published by the original teams. And sometimes they are kind of housed with the data in some archives. And then you might be interested in looking at the metadata assigned to each particular file, each interview transcript, for instance, to think about whether the participant characteristics might be appropriate for your study as well. The use that is to guide kind of the construction of your corpus. As I say, some repositories curate this material alongside, others you might have to go and do a bit more kind of detective work to find some of those things, or to liaise with the original researchers to find out more about the context of the study. And then this selected data, once you've kind of done this process, that's pooled to create your new corpus. And then sort of step two is comprises a ground-based geophysical survey of the data landscape or the corpus to assess what merits closer investigation. So conceptual and substantive areas of relevance to your research aims and questions. And this step involves conducting breadth analysis. So this is where the computational tools come in to help identify concepts associated with your interests across the corpus. And just a sort of note to say that we often talk about textual data mining, and that can be kind of a bit confusing when we've been thinking about this in terms of it implying a deep investigation. But actually we see it as more appropriate to consider these techniques as enabling extensive surface level analysis, essential for gaining an overview, but unsuitable for kind of more in-depth insights. So there's a range of different tools that might help you provide this geophysical survey. So we've used, in a lot of our teaching and training, we use free to access text analytic tools like AntConc. We use in our own work, and I'll show you an example in a moment, we use some packages that enable semantic analysis. So I've used Leximancer a lot, and that sort of enables you to do conceptual and thematic mapping. And then Emma and Lynn at Edinburgh work with a computational social scientist to use a programming language R. So as part of our project, we're really experimenting with the capabilities of different tools and also our own capabilities as qualitative researchers. Think about what we might need to do to build capacity in learning a program like R, or whether other software might be suitable as well. So lots of work around different suitability of software. And obviously increasingly there's going to be a number of AI-powered research tools, increasing number of tools that will enable us to do this kind of analysis in different ways that we need to critically think about. And so the choice is going to be determined by your own skill set, kind of the makeup of your team and the resources available to you. And despite the sort of differences in mechanisms of each software tool, the majority employ algorithm data-driven sifting and sorting of kind of bags of words and sets of text in order to search for associations. And these process thousands of iterations to see how words travel together in a text or set of text. And these processes are premised on the notion that the terms surrounding a given word help determine its meaning. So the sorts of things that we've looked at for this sort of geophysical surveying and kind of this breadth analysis using data mining, simple things could be looking at keywords or words that represent a particular topic, or you could count frequencies, looking at words that appear with higher frequencies to the comparative norm. a lot of the work we've done has been around keyness and words which occur with unusual frequency or infrequency in the target corpus in comparison to a reference corpus. So we've been looking at things like concordance, words that occur immediately or before or after a word, co-location and proximity, so terms that feature together in a text, or kind of clusters, so keywords that with similar meanings that are grouped together. And this helps you really just to like handle this mass of qualitative data and look for where there might be kind of these, to go back to the archaeological metaphor, particular subsurface features that you might want to examine. You might want to think about in terms of digging, places you might want to dig deeper into the data. So I mainly used Leximancer across several projects. And this uses AI and it looks at word frequency and co-occurrence to create these clusters of terms that are inclined to feature together. And the outcome is the generation of this interactive concept map. There's a lot of work that goes into doing that, cleaning the data and going back and forth. So I don't want to make it look like you just upload your transcripts and then this comes out, because that would, there's a lot of work in terms, especially with interview transcripts, where you're looking for ambiguous terms, anonymization codes, where a kind of particular ways, phrasing and things that will kind of generate some really interesting and strange things. There's lots of data cleansing that goes on, but once you've done that, this is an example of the kind of output, and you can zoom in and out of that to get more or less detail. And you can kind of explore, you can use Boolean queries to explore relationships between things. So on the map here, the kind of the words relate to the concepts that have been generated in this output. And then these have been clustered into themes, color-coded themes. So the hotter themes are the more salient themes in the corpus, and the cooler colors are the less prominent themes. Now, what's interesting is that often you might think, okay, I'll start with the most salient, but actually, as we've found, they're the things that are really obvious, because that's what a lot of the original projects are about. So sometimes it's more interesting to look at the slightly less salient themes for areas of interest. So So step 2 involves working iteratively, moving between these kinds of outputs and the original data, and I should show you how you can do that in a minute, to kind of look at this data in context. So if we go to the next slide, you can see this gives you a sense of Leximancer's interface. So you've got the concept map there, and then on the right, you've got this panel, but we can look for different, it gives you a variety of different functions. But here it's looking at the relationship between mother and money. And you have all the extracts in relation to that from the transcripts. And you can also see if you've got carefully labeled data, you can trace that back to the project and the case. So you can constantly work between the context, the extracts and context of this concept map. So importantly, we don't see the outcomes of this mapping as the end point, but rather just as an archaeologist would view a geophysical survey as a means to inform where to dig test pits. Step 2 is concerned with using computational tools to determine where to dig deeper into the data. So this is guiding where you might look further. So step 3 is concerned with moving from breadth to depth. And this comprises the sampling and preliminary analysis of short data extracts generated during step 2. So as you saw on the previous screen, you can see the extracts generated under that. That was a relationship between two concepts and all the extracts generated under that. So then you might sample for that if you're really interested in doing a project on motherhood and money. So drawing on our archaeological metaphor, this step is akin to digging shallow test pits just deep enough into the data to judge whether or not there's material of relevance. Now, I think across the team, most of the team some of the team have got more a mixed methods background, but most qualitative. It was really hard not to dig deeper into the data. It's really hard not to get really immersed in the material and to be very almost ruthless about doing this kind of cursory reading or just seeing whether this material is relevant or not. So whilst it might be tempting to start to engage with the data in depth, it really is the purpose of this step just to dig deep enough to identify data as salient. Step 4 is where you go into things in more depth. But at this stage, you could be faced with a substantial number, perhaps hundreds of extracts, and these need to be sampled for usefulness and salient to determine areas worthy of further investigation. So attention needs to be given to your sample size, and this will be shaped by your sampling logic, which in turn is shaped by your research design, as well as practical considerations of time and resources. And so, yes, so you're just doing this cursory reading of short data extracts. And this also often involves looking at the data immediately around that extract to give you a sense of the meaning and the context in which that sort of sentence or couple of sentences has been used. And this will help you determine whether the extracts are relevant. So again, if you're using software like Leximancer, you can look at these keywords in context. So this is kind of, it's highlighted where the context is, and then you need to make a decision really how much of that extract you're going to read before and after to get a sense of what that's about. And we've often been asked when we run training courses, well, how much shall I read? It's very hard to put a number on it, but it's usually around 100 to 200 words. But we found there's a bit of a variation between whether that's interview data or focus group data, usually a bit shorter focus group data because tends to be people turn taking and speaking. So it's a little bit shorter, but something around that cursory reading of short data extract. And any keywords or concepts that seem ambiguous or have multiple meanings or lack purchase for your research focus should be eliminated at that stage. And prior to moving to step 4, you might want to sample, as I said, some of the keywords and concepts that seem a bit less striking or salient because they may be of potential value to your analysis. Equally, if your test bit on motherhood and money isn't fruitful, it doesn't generate material of interest to your topic, then you might need to go back to step 2 and do some more geophysical surveying to get a sense of where to dig elsewhere in the data. And then the final step concerns kind of archaeological deep excavation, exploring in detail specific cases of interest, focusing on depth rather than breadth. So you've kind of dug these test pits, you've identified areas where you want to dig deeper into data. You can then go back to the whole transcript. You can sample and go back to the whole transcript of a set of transcripts to do more in-depth analysis. So this involves that immersion in whole cases and using more conventional forms of qualitative analysis. So importantly, this step involves a sensitivity to the context in which the data is generated, and also to the detail and multi-layered complexity that constitutes qualitative work. So depending on the approach employed, you might want to reorganize data, explore and identify, interpret patterns, meanings, the processes and relationships between them. And hopefully this will be a little bit clearer when I show you a kind of worked example shortly. The approach you select will be dependent on your epistemological stance, your theoretical framework that's guiding your work, your substantive interests, your research questions, and along with kind of the practicalities of the configuration of the data. But you might wish to use discourse analysis, framework analysis, narrative, thematic. You could use any range of more conventional approaches to qualitative research, depending on your research question and interests. And you might employ kind of more than one method to look at different facets of the material. And during step 4, other areas of relevance might come to light. So you might then immerse yourself in the cases, start exploring something else of interest might be apparent in some of those cases, and you might then go back to the breadth analysis to see kind of if that's a common occurrence. So in this method, we work iteratively back and forth with zooming out to the aerial view and zooming into the in-depth view simultaneously. And each of the 4 steps is guided by the previous. So the keywords or concepts generated using data mining tools is step 2, shape your preliminary analysis, and the examination of short extracts is step 3. And these extracts are then used as the basis for in-depth analysis in step 4. So we developed this over several years, experimented with different ways, and then started to think about what is the value of this big qual analysis. So I should have said at the beginning that we the whole team continue to work with smaller scale studies. It's still an important part of our work, and we really see huge value in individual qualitative projects that we see them as invaluable in providing in-depth insights into social processes, subjectivities and complexity. But there are also some benefits from doing this larger scale analysis, bringing data sets together, working across multiple studies. So, for example, you can ask new comparative questions. These can make use of the substantive, the temporal, the geographical differences between studies to explore across projects as well. Yeah, and theoretical generalisability can be achieved by expanding and diversifying the participant pool and the sample, offering insights into social processes across different contexts. And I think probably for me, one of the real values of this is that it has policy and practice utility. Big qual analysis can provide extensive coverage of macro level issues, but also intensive illumination at a more granular level. So I thought I'd share one example from a collaborative project that we conducted a few years ago. So this was with testing the method out with some other colleagues. And so we were asked So the Lancet were putting together a series on young people and their experiences in different food environments. And they had a lot of quantitative studies they were drawing on as part of this work and wanted to do something large, a large-scale qualitative study that really sort of held central young people's voices within this to try and develop some sort of critical mass in the area. So this work was commissioned by the Lancet and funded by Foundation Botner and Wellcome. And we're focusing on food choice in transition. So this particular article on the screen brings together that quantitative and qualitative analysis. It's reported separately, but within the same paper, looking at young people's agency and autonomy in different food environments in different global contexts. So we use the breadth and depth method, and some of the team had already been working on it as part of a network of studies conducted in different international contexts, particularly in Africa and India, working with teams there looking at young people's experiences in different food environments. And then we kind of pooled these with other studies that have been undertaken separately. So in the end, we had studies that have been conducted in different sites in Bangladesh, Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, India, Indonesia, South Africa, Gambia, and the UK as well. So a huge amount of data. And although the original studies were designed to address slightly different research questions, they all had a very similar broad substantive focus. They all employed either in-depth interviews or focus group discussions to generate data, and either with young people themselves or with parents and carers. So there's two sets of within each study. So, and we had the huge advantage of being able to either work directly with or consult researchers from the original teams to deepen our understanding of the context of the data generation and participants' lives, to help with that more interpretive work in the last step of the process. So we pulled and reorganised data from 650 participants, and this data was organised by age. So we separated out the responses from young people and those from parents and carers, and then by food environment types. And there's a high-level panel of experts food classification system that emphasises things like availability, affordability, promotion, quality and safety in food. So we had 6 groupings by age and by food environment. And then we used Lexomancer to provide an overview of the whole data set, and then also generated concepts maps based on each of these 6 groupings that we could then do some comparative work with. So as we spoke about earlier, these two-dimensional visual maps of extracted material, they use word frequencies and co-occurrence to create clusters of terms. And then we spent a lot of time poring over these maps, zooming in and out and examining different aspects of them. And as I mentioned earlier, some of these things are really unsurprising given the focus of the original studies. It wasn't surprising that things like health were amongst the more salient themes. But we started to explore some of the differences, things that had come up in some particular groupings and things that hadn't. So one of the things that interested me particularly was snacks, the importance of snacks to young people and the marginal spaces in which they ate them and sort of hung out together in different communities and how important that was to them in terms of kind of health and diet. So then so that was step 2. For step 3, we had hundreds of short extracts. Luckily, we were a reasonable sized team to do that, to help us identify areas of interest. So we worked iteratively between these maps and the transcript data. We ran Boolean searches based on the relationships between concepts highlighted in the maps. And then we did cursory readings of all the material to help us identify extracts of relevance for a more in-depth analysis. And then for step 4, we employed thematic analysis. We explored commonalities and differences between the age and food environment groupings. We coded those of relevance to our research questions and then reorganized these into themes. And we also examined particular features of the data. So in more depth, for how, not just the content of what people were talking about, but how they were talking about things. And then we worked closely with the data extracts throughout to ensure participants' voices don't remain represented within that. So overall, I would say the breadth and depth method allowed us to explore similarities and differences, and it provided much needed insights into young people's perspectives across a broad range of contexts. And so as part of this Lancet series then, academics, policy representatives, advocacy support organisations have engaged with the paper, and it formed part of this series launch that was part of the Tokyo Nutrition for Growth Summit in 2021. And I think Big Qual really helped us strengthen the evidence base in the field. And I think there was huge advantage in being able to work with the original team, to some of the teams involved in the analysis, whereas others were available and talked us through the context in which data was generated and any interesting and unusual things that they'd observed. I think in an ideal world, more time and with more time and resources, it would be great to have a stronger collaboration and be conducting this kind of analysis jointly. Whereas kind of, I guess, the resources sat within the UK in terms of access to this kind of software, which is relatively expensive. So I thought I'd finish with a few reflections on working with qualitative integrity at scale. So really, how do we start as we start to build this, I think, hopefully you might do too, it is an exciting new field of big qual. How do we ensure that big qual is conducted with qualitative integrity? And as we know, methodological and interpretive integrity are key to research. Integrity, qualitative researchers, integrity is relational between researchers and participants, between original and new researchers and research teams, and between researchers and research institutions. So reusers of qualitative data trust that the original researchers worked with methodological and interpretive integrity and have conducted studies responsibly and with honesty. Similarly, researchers, teams, and participants involved in the generation of data trust that any reusers handle data responsibly and with care and respect, and that the efforts of those who kind of co-produce the data, made the data available, are respecting the efforts of those who co-produce and made the data available. So in our experience, we feel it's kind of important. Some things we've kind of sort of thought about as we've been going along. We feel, and this probably relates more to archive data, that we need to explore as far as possible the philosophical underpinnings and ethical approaches of the original teams and be reflective and open about our own assumptions and positionings towards the data. It's really important that we look beyond the use value of existing data and treat with care and respect the investments made by the original researchers and participants. So with any approach to qualitative analysis, both qualitative and quantitative, comes the danger that if not practiced with care, the contribution of the original researchers or participants could, albeit unintentionally, be exploited. So for instance, studies combining data generated in different national contexts must be alert to the possibility that the work of the original researchers could be reduced to data generators if opportunities to collaborate on any reuse endeavours are not evident. And I think that's kind of one limitation of the study that I mentioned, that I wish there'd be more opportunity to do that. And also for primary researchers, there's much work involved in data preparation, curation, and that's often really undervalued and under-resourced. Despite the view of data as co-constructed, researchers are often not afforded the same privileges as participants relating to anonymity, confidentiality, and so on. So if we're encouraged to kind of make qualitative data available to reuse, we often don't think about kind of the place of the researcher within that and what other people might think of them as an interviewer or designer of research or analyst. So I think it's important to think about kind of how the identities of researchers and what they kind of reveal of themselves, particularly in kind of qualitative interviews and focus groups, how they interact with participants, their techniques and approaches, and just that messiness of qualitative work are often laid bare within the artifacts of qualitative data. So I think that's something to be really thoughtful about, that we need to be really thoughtful about. Then there's that danger that it might, with greater scrutiny comes a danger that researchers feel exposed personally or professionally, or that their investments are exploited or reputation damaged. So if desirable or feasible, I think it's really useful to work with the original researchers, though we recognise this might not always be viable because the original researchers might not have time or interest, or they may just not be traceable anymore if it's a study that was conducted some years ago. So we try to think about ourselves as custodians tasked with caring forward about data in a manner that's mindful of the voices within that data, as well as who might be missing or unrepresented. So in particular, in the context of archive data, so again, there's a real push to reuse qualitative data. But if we keep reusing the same data sets, if the voices are seldom listened to, individual groups are underrepresented or absent from those archive data sets, then reusing such material will only perpetuate those inequities. And a further challenge associated with sourcing data for big qual is whilst there's an increasing number of repositories, these are not distributed globally. They're not equally distributed globally. So a reliance on archive material could exacerbate the dominance of research from European and North American contexts and perspectives to the exclusion of settings where the necessary digital infrastructure doesn't yet exist. Fourthly, we think it's important to acknowledge and where possible mitigate against the shortcomings of some of the computational tools employed, recognising how assumptions underlying approaches to text mining that rely on algorithm-based tools can shape the outcomes. So for us, using the computational tools to conduct such analysis represented a very big departure from the approaches we'd adopted previously and made us acutely aware of the ethical challenges in doing so. As I mentioned earlier, we experimented with a range of tools, examples such as leximancer, so the kind of patented algorithms employed by many machine learning, data mining and semantic analysis tools are not transparent to the user. And these algorithms are used to sift through thousands of iterations to see how words travel together through a text or set of documents in order to kind of pinpoint words that are co-located beyond that considered random statistically. So much of what qualitative researchers strive for rests on taking a reflexive approach that acknowledges and allows for different ontological positions. So there's a danger that researchers may not be aware of or be able to determine the basis of the world views on which kind of these tools are constructed and any inherent biases. And then the final sort of reflection we've had is around the importance of moving iteratively between the abstracted breadth analysis and the minutiae of the data. So reconnecting all the time with the context. And we think this kind of helps mitigate against some of the challenges I've just outlined. And I think an issue with big data is analytic distance and the dangers of decontextualization and misunderstanding the context in which the data is generated. So with large-scale qualitative analysis, it can prove challenging to both access a sense of the context in which individual cases or data sets are generated, and also when bringing together lots of studies to hold these multiple contexts in your mind whilst you're working with lots of different studies and grappling with this large volume of data. So I hope that the strength of the breadth and depth method is that this iterative nature where you're moving back and forth between the broader surveying techniques and the more in-depth elements helps with this. So to conclude then, as Cathy Mills said in 2018, she argued that it's long been recognised that despite the superior speed of mathematical computations, computers are unable to capture the subtlety, creativity and personality that real human beings demonstrate across social contexts. For us, computational tools must not be employed uncritically, and data mining shouldn't be regarded as the destination, but rather a staging post on the journey. And with the breadth and depth method, we regard computational tools as a means of sifting through and gaining that overview of the corpus that will then help with more in-depth analysis. And this process doesn't replace the iterative work of the researcher, but rather enables new or different questions to be asked of the corpus. And this sits alongside, but not in competition with, smaller scale work. Exciting time for qualitative inquiry, not just those work, but also for kind of qualitative, quantitative and computational analysis and bringing those things together. And I think looking back to that question raised when we first presented our plans in 2016, why would you want to do that, which was a bit disheartening at the time, we're much more likely to now be asked, how do you do that? And so we've trained about 500 people internationally in the method now. And the original paper that we wrote, despite our fears that nobody wants to do this, has now been accessed 24,000 times, I looked yesterday. So there must be some interest in it. So thank you for listening. And I hope, I've included some resources that you might be book out. And we have a range of papers and sort of a website as well with some resources on if you're interested in taking this further. Thank you.